Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming out today. On behalf of the Department of Arab and Islamic Civilizations, I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's lecture. We're honored to have with us today Professor Rachida Chih, who is our Bayard Dodge Distinguished Visiting Professor for 2024. The Bayard Dodge Distinguished Visiting Professorship is the highlight of our academic year. The program's been generously funded by the Cleveland Dodge Foundation since the mid-1980s in honor of the late Dr. Bayard Dodge, a scholar of Islamic and Middle Eastern studies who served as the third president of the American University of Beirut and who was also a visiting professor at the AUC. This generous professorship allows us to invite every year a leading scholar in the fields of Arabic and Islamic studies. The idea is to share with our students and faculty, but also with the Cairo public, some of the recent scholarship in our fields. The visiting professor typically spends around a week with us on campus, delivering public lectures and spending time with our faculty and students, usually leading a methodology workshop as well. And over the years, we've been quite lucky to invite a number of leading academics and intellectuals whose scholarship has been quite inspiring. So in the past, the program has hosted such figures as Abdel Hamid Sabra, Edward Said, Wadad Qadi, Wilfred Madelung, Joseph Van Es, Tarif al-Khalidi, Margaret Larkin, Nasser al-Rabat, Marina Rostow, Christian Gruber, and many others. 29, in fact, in all. We're very happy and honored today to be welcoming Professor Rachida Chih as our 30th Bayard Dodge Distinguished Visiting Professor. Professor Chih is Senior Research Fellow at the French National Center for Scientific Research, the CNRS. She studied at the University of Aix-Marseille, earning her doctorate in Arabic and Islamic Studies in 1996, and her habilitation in Islamic Studies in 2015. Last year, in 2023, she was a visiting professor at the Graduate School of Asian and African Area Studies at Kyoto University in Japan. She is no stranger to Cairo, having spent at least 4 years from 1997 to 2001 as research fellow at the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology, the IFAO. Professor Chih's research interests revolve around the history of Sufism, especially in Egypt and Morocco, in the Ottoman and early modern periods. She has published 2 monographs. In 2000, a book in French on the Sufi orders in 20th century Egypt, and in 2019, her book, Sufism in Ottoman Egypt, Circulation, Renewal, and Authority in the 17th and 18th century. She is currently working on a book on the Prophet Muhammad in the mirror of his community, devotion, identity, and politics in modern Islam. And in relation to this interest, she has also recently edited with others the 3-volume work, The Presence of the Prophet in Early Modern and Contemporary Islam, which came out as part of the series Brill Handbook of Oriental Studies. She has also edited and co-edited a number of other books and published numerous book chapters and journal articles, including Prophetic Piety, Mysticism, and Authority in Pre-Modern Arabic Devotional Literature, which was published in the International Journal of Middle East Studies in 2022. As we discussed who to invite this year, Dr. Chih's research stood out partly because of its interdisciplinarity, which echoes the approaches of our own department. Her work covers areas of both early and modern Sufism and brings together the intellectual study of Sufi ideas with that of practice and social history. She also works on 2 of the important centers of Sufism, Egypt and Morocco, and the links that connect Sufis in both centers and beyond to other parts of the Muslim world. Her more recent work on devotional practices and devotional literature, books that focus on the veneration of the Prophet Muhammad, also brings into discussion literary analysis of texts, their material history, through studies of the manuscripts and the illumination and paintings included in them, in addition to the social and political histories of the periods in which this devotional literature spread and became popular. In tonight's lecture, Professor Chih will be focusing in particular on al-Jazuli's Dala'il al-Khayrat, one of the most famous and popular of the devotional texts, and its influence on religious and social life in Ottoman Egypt. She will discuss dissemination and the sites and channels of its production and transmission, and in so doing, situate it in relation to other devotional texts. Professor Chih will also be delivering another lecture next Saturday, the 16th of November at 6 p.m., also here at Oriental Hall, under the title Sufism in Ottoman Egypt, Historiography, Sources, and Methodology. And we hope you will also be able to share with us and come join us on that event. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Rachida Chih.
Two public lectures and the workshop for the graduate students will focus on the religious history of Egypt, which I have studied over the long duration, starting in the long 20th centuries and going back to the 17th century. So my research topic is Sufism and its institutions, the Sufi brotherhoods, which I approach in all their dimensions, spiritual, social, and political. In the course of my three presentations, I acknowledge my debt and pay tribute to my professors at the University of Aix-en-Provence, some of whom are no longer with us, to the Egyptian School of Ottoman History, and more broadly, to Egypt, its people, and its history. It was thanks to the use of its manuscripts and archives, and to the field work I carried out in Upper Egypt, that I was able to complete my doctoral thesis and habilitation, and that I obtained positions and academic recognition, which means that I find myself today in this prestigious university, following in the footsteps of no less prestigious predecessors. My warmest thanks go to Dean John Melroy for his kind invitation, and Dr. Ahmed Khan for putting my name forward. I would also like to thank those at the Department of Arab and Islamic Civilizations who organized my arrival in Cairo in the best possible conditions, Marwa Sabri and Dr. Amin al-Bandari. I hope that my presentations will live up to the honor you have done me. My first lecture will be about a little book, a collection of prayers for the Prophet composed in mid-15th century Morocco by a Sufi named Muhammad al-Jazuli, who died in 1465. It's titled Dala'il al-Khayrat wa Shawariq al-Anwar fi al-Zikr al-Salat ala al-Nabi al-Mukhtar, proofs of good deeds and brilliant bursts of lights in the remembrance of blessings on the chosen Prophet. It is not one of the great classics of Islam, yet between the date of its completion, around 1453, 1457, and the end of the 19th century, it was probably the most recited and copied religious text after the Quran, whose sacredness in the Maghreb was second only to that of the Holy Book. Above all, apart from the Quran, it was the first religious text to be globally distributed, probably from the 17th century onwards, through manuscripts that were relayed by the printing press in the 19th century. I am indebted to Professor Nelly Hanna for bringing this bestseller to my attention through her groundbreaking book, In Praise of Books, published in 2003. Professor Hanna writes that in the 18th century Egypt, copyists made their living solely from copying the Dala'il, and that many waqfs stipulated that it should be recited regularly in mosques in the same way as the Quran. The global distribution of the Dala'il is a spectacular sign of the veneration of the Prophet, which this little book promotes, and whose fame under the Ottomans marked the apogee. Another spectacular sign of its popularity is the account given by Suleiman ibn Suhaim, who died in 1767, a contemporary and fervent critic of Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, who died 1791, the eponymous founder of Wahhabism. During one of his conquests with his allies, the Saud, Abd al-Wahhab burnt the Dala'il in public, arguing that he was more loved than the Quran. In a previous article on the Dala'il that I have published in Ijmez in 2022, I have focused on the content of the prayers to show how they helped to disseminate to a popular audience a doctrine of sainthood inherited from the Prophet and originating in Sufi scholarly circles, a doctrine whose Social and political stakes were as important for the Sufis as to were important to the Sufis as to the elites who patronized, sponsored them. For the purposes of this talk, I will focus on a different issue, that of the circulation and reception of the Dala'il, and attempt to answer two interrelated questions. How did al-Jazuli's Dala'il become one of the most popular texts in the Islamic Sunni tradition, and what influence these texts have in religious and social life in Ottoman Egypt? My presentation is in three parts. Thank you. So my presentation is in three parts. First, in order to respond to the difficult and still unanswered question of the dissemination of the Dala'il, we must examine the venues and channels of its production and transmission, and to this end, situate this prayer book in relation to other devotional texts in what I will term the economy of prophetic piety. By an economy of prophetic piety, I mean a system for the production and distribution of symbolic goods relating to the knowledge about the Prophet, which was integrated into scholarly networks that linked the Islamic West and East in pre-modern Islam. So what was this knowledge? Devotional texts, such as the Dala'il, diffused knowledge about the status of the Prophet as the last Prophet, and his attributes as merciful of the words, mediator, and intercessor. They also work to bring the Prophet closer to believers and stir their love and veneration for him through descriptions of his beauty and virtue, the Shama'il. I will show how the appearance of the Dala'il during the 15th century is both a culmination and a turning point in the economy of this prophetology, which was established from the very beginnings of Islam and developed over the long duration. Then I will address the political, economic, and institutional conditions relating to the circulation of the Dala'il from the Islamic West to the Islamic East, in which this text was to become so widely renowned. I will move away from the textual approach of my first section and examine the Dala'il as a book, an object circulating in time and in space. Starting in the mid-15th century, the Dala'il was rapidly diffused through the Maghreb al-Aqsa and Ifriqiya. It most probably spread through the eastern parts of the Muslim world in the first half of the 17th century, benefiting from the Pax Ottomanica and from Ottoman religious policy. The increase in production and the vast distribution of a manuscript such as the Dala'il signifies the existence of an active network of scholars and their institutions, mosques, zawiya, tekke, private houses, where such texts were copied and transmitted, and of political elites who sponsored such institutions. The decline of these institutions and milieu from the end of the 19th century, with the arrival of printing, the rise of Islamic reformism, and especially the diminishing role of the state in the patronage of religious institutions, led to the disappearance of the genre. In the third and final section of this presentation, I will examine how the textual knowledge about the Prophet is actualized and materialized through spaces and bodies in Ottoman Egypt. The Dala'il established a new devotional practice to the Prophet in both public and private spaces. Official celebrations of the Prophet's birth, the Mawlid, during the Ottoman period stimulated the composition and distribution of new accounts of his birth, Mawlidiyat, of poems praising him, Madaih Nabawiyya, and of collections of supplications and prayers invoking divine blessing upon him, Salawat. Such texts were also recited in private homes during life cycle celebrations. Sufi brotherhoods have incorporated this new devotional practice into their rituals and played a significant role in its spread to a popular audience. First, I would like to briefly recall the function of the Dala'il. The organization of the collection of a collection follows a clear sequence. After a short introduction, muqaddimah, from the author, it starts with an overture, iftitah, that invokes God by his 99 beautiful names. But invokes God by his 99 beautiful names, Asma Allah al-Husna. This is followed by an introductory prayer, Dua al-Iftitah. Then, by a chapter listing more than 30 hadiths that are claimed to be authentic, sahih, and relate to the virtues, benefits, and rewards in this world and the next of praying for the Prophet. Fasfifat al-Salat al-Nabi. Then comes a list of 201 of Muhammad's names, Asma Sayyidina wa Maulana Muhammad, the aim of which is to allow the reader to know the Prophet better, understand his unique attributes and qualities. This list sums up the theological and mystical doctrines concerning the person of Muhammad. It underlines the Prophet's elevated rank before God, al-Maqam al-Mahmud, al-Daraja al-Rafi'a, his mercy, Nabi Rahma, Mu'ti Rahma, his assistance, and finally, his intercession on the Day of Judgment, Shafi' al-Ummah. In the subsequent passages, more than 400 prayers are divided into 8 sections for a weekly recitation. Beyond informing believers about the status of the Prophet's rank before God and the merits of praying for him, the main function of these prayers is to evoke love for the Prophet by describing his beauty and virtues in such a way that the believer may visualize him as if he were physically present. The message conveyed by the Dala'il is that it is the love of the Prophet that will save from the fire, and therefore the recitation of the salawat became the principal act of devotion to the Prophet in the economy of salvation. Salli Allah, to pray on, over, and not to pray for, to pray on, over. For this prayer is a request made to God that he might shed his blessings and his mercy on over the Prophet, since the Prophet is the mediator, wasita, of this mercy. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, says the verse of the Quran, Quran 21:107. This request extends to his family, the Ahl al-Bayt, and his companions. The prayers are often variations on the Abrahamic prayer, Salat al-Ibrahimiyya, O God, bless Muhammad and the family of Muhammad as you blessed Abraham and the family of Abraham. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim. The composition of the Dala'il in Morocco in the middle of the 15th century is inscribed in a double temporality. It is a response to the political situation of its own time. This was a time of crisis. Almost nothing was left of Al-Andalus. The Portuguese were threatening the Moroccan coastline, and the country was plunged into the political chaos of the decline and fall of the Marinid dynasty. The Marinid dynasty, 1258-1465. And the Marinid promoted Sharifism, that is to say, the practice of laying claim to prestige and power, sulta, on the basis of descendants from the Prophet. Jazuli presented himself as a Sharif and the continuer of the prophetic mission and defender of Dala'il Islam, working to compile and report traditions that exhort the faithful to pray for the Prophet as a spiritual exercise, but also as a rallying cry for Jazuli's disciples who took part to the jihad in the defense of the coast in the Ribat. Ribat are fortified monasteries. But the Dala'il is also inscribed in a long-term phenomenon, that of a construction of a body of knowledge about the Prophet that developed from the very beginnings of Islam and was fixed between the 9th and 11th centuries. With the canonization of Hadith, the Prophet's Sunnah became a source of Sharia with the same authority as the Quran. As this happened, representations and images of the Prophet evolved towards a sacralization of his person, which had already begun in Ibn Hisham's Sirah, notably in the literature of the proofs of prophecy, Dala'il and Nubuwah. This literature recounts episodes from the life of the Prophet, underlined by miraculous events that occurred before and after his birth, bringing with them proof of the superiority of Muhammad to all other prophets, the most definitive proof being the Quran, and of his status as the seal of prophets. Proofs include the mark between the prophet's shoulder blades and the miracles, of which the greatest is the Mi'raj. During his elevation to God, the prophet receives, at his own request, the right to intercede for his community on the Day of Judgment. The two founding texts of the genre are Kharkushi died 1015, 1016, Sharaf al-Mustafa, the nobility of the chosen one, and Bayhaqi died 1066, Dala'il al-Nubuwah, the proofs of prophecy. The 9th century is also the period when the first treatises on the merits of praying for the Prophet, for the Salat al-Nabi, appeared, but they were composed of hadith, and their author were ulama. With the rise of Sunnism and the ulama acquiring greater power in the context of the fragmentation of the Abbasid Empire, the Abbasids 750-1258, Sufis were laying claim to a religious authority greater than that of the ulama on the basis of their mystical, esoteric interpretation of the Quran and the Hadith, the walaya, divine friendship, as a prolongation, a continuation of the nubuwah, the prophecy. This doctrine was developed by the Khorasan mystic at-Tirmizi, who died 892. Tirmizi's contemporaries, at-Tustari, who died 896, and al-Hallaj, who died 922, began to evoke the luminous reality of the Prophet, Nur Muhammadi, and the primordial status according to him in creation. The first thing God created is the light of Muhammad, which he made with a handful of his own light. From this primordial light, all other things were created. In this way, the concept of the Prophet's impeccable and inviolable nature, Isma, was expanded under Sufi influence to include his cosmic reality and eternal presence. From the concept of the ontological primacy of Muhammad's light in the 13th century, in the context of the rise of the great tariqah, and based on the works of these early Sufis, the Andalusi mystic Ibn Arabi, who died 1240, elaborated the doctrine of the Muhammadan reality, Haqiqa Muhammadiyya, which will have a profound influence on the Sufi doctrine of sainthood. This is a complex doctrine explained by Michel Chodkiewicz in his groundbreaking book, Seal of a Saint, Prophethood and Sainthood in the Doctrine of Ibn Arabi. So, the Prophet brings together in his person divine realities and human qualities. He was sent as an incarnate human being to spread God's message and serve as a guide and a beautiful model for his community, Bashir, Nazir, Uswa Hasana. He is also a metaphysical, spiritual reality, Haqiqa Muhammadiyya, and Sufis seek union with the spiritual essence of the Prophet, Azzat al-Muhammadi, and the practice of reciting prayers for the Prophet become the means to experience the spiritual presence, the hadra, the spiritual presence of the Prophet, and to be guided by the Prophet and incarnate his model with all its attributes of guidance, intercession, and salvation. The first prayer for the Prophet appeared in the 12th century onwards. They were composed by Sufi masters who were the eponymous founders of the great Sufi orders that were being formed at this time and whose prophetic descendants was emphasized. Abd al-Qadir al-Jilani, who died 1166, Ahmed al-Rifai, who died 1178, Ahmed al-Badawi, who died 1276, Ibrahim al-Disuki, who died 1296, and Abu al-Hasan al-Jazuli, who died 1258, all composed celebrated prayers for the Prophet. So did Ibn Mashish, who died 1228, and Ibn Arabi. In the minor prayer, Salat al-Sukhra by Jilani, founder of the Qadiriyya, the Prophet is primordial light that preceded creation, whose manifestation is mercy for the worlds. السابق للخلق نوره ورحمة للعالمين ظهوره. In Rifai's prayer, Jawharat al-Asrar, the jewel of secrets, the Prophet is described as the pre-existent light of God, Nurika al-Asbaq. In his luminous prayer, the Salat al-Nur or Salat al-Nuraniya, Ahmed al-Badawi, founder of the Ahmadiyya, describes the Prophet as a tree of luminous origin, Shajarat al-Asr al-Nuraniya, the brilliance of the merciful handful, Lam'a al-Qabda al-Rahmaniya, mine of the divine secrets, Ma'dan al-Asrar al-Rabbaniya, owner of the original handful, Sahib al-Qabda al-Asliya. In the Mashishiyya by Abd al-Salam ibn Mashish, who was the master of the Shaziliya's founder, Abu al-Hasan al-Shazili. The Prophet is, you can follow the Arabic text, I'm going to give the translation. The Prophet is the one from whom the secrets burst forth and the lights emanated, in whom were sublimated the ultimate realities and deposited the science of Adam. The Mashishiyya ends with the following supplication: "O my God, is your comprehensive secret who gives evidence of you, and your greatest veil standing between your hands. Join me to his lineage, realize me through his spiritual nobility, and make me know him through a knowledge that spares me the wells of ignorance and nourishes me from the springs of grace. Carry me along his path towards your presence." So the Prophet's function as mediator of the mystic's spiritual realization is clearly expressed in the Mashishiyya. Along with the great beauty of the text, this explains its widespread diffusion in other Sufi orders beyond the Shaziliya. The Prophet is described as the supreme veil. The Sufi can only raise this veil and contemplate the pure divine essence, experiencing Fada, the extension of individual consciousness in the divine presence through the Prophet's mediation. From the 12th century onwards, the composition of Tasliya became a feature of Sufism. During the 2 centuries between the appearance of the first prayers and that of the appearance of Jazuli's collection, the Sufi concept of Nur Muhammadi, of the living presence of the Prophet, and of his wasita, that is to say, the possibility of access to knowledge of the divine order through the Prophet's mediation, what the German Orientalist Tilman Nagel calls Muhammad dogmatic, was transmitted to a popular audience thanks to a major historic event, the first Sunni celebration of the birth of the Prophet, the Mawlid, at the beginning of the 13th century by the Ayyubids in Erbil and Cairo, and the Prince of Septa, Abu al-Abbas al-Azafi, in northern Morocco. These celebrations, organized by princely courts, featured public recitations of narratives of the birth of the Prophet, Mawlidiyat. These narratives elaborate on the light of the Prophet and the way it was transferred from Adam and through the first prophets until it reached its fullest manifestation in history called Muhammad. Celebration also included recitations of panegyrics praising his virtues, qualities, and miracles, the Madih Nabawi, expressing love for God's messenger and asking for his intercession. The Madih Nabawi is organized around an individual and privileged relationship with the Prophet, whom the believer addresses directly, humbly, and submissively, seeking the Prophet's mediation and expressing yearning and desire to visit him in Medina, his resting place. The very well-known praise poem by the Egyptian al-Busiri, who died in 1298, Qasidat al-Burda, dates from this period and is still immensely popular across the Muslim world. The Dala'il builds on this medieval heritage with its dialectical relationship between scholarly and popular culture. Its content is both initiatory, reserved for an elite of Sufis, and accessible to a wide audience. Unlike the more doctrinally dense Sufi prayers, such as the Nuraniya or the Mashishiyya, with their allusive and symbolic style that was accessible only to initiates, al-Jazuli's prayers are graspable for the novice as well as the masses, and their simple style is intended to make them easy to memorize. The collection was conceived for a daily use. It is divided into 8 sections: Hizb, Ahzab, an appellation associated with the Quran, which is divided into 60 Ahzab, and each Hizb corresponds to one day of the week, and the weekly recitation from one Monday to the next is perfectly regulated. Hizb also refers to Sufi litanies, some of which were already popular in Shaziliya milieu during Jazuli's lifetime, such as Abul Hasan al-Shazili Hizb al-Bar, the Great Litany, and Hizb al-Bahr, the Litany of the Sea. But the Dala'il marks a turning point because it is the first known, and to this day the best known, collection of prayers for the Prophet in Sunni Islam, and probably the earliest collection conceived in the form of a daily zikr for the disciples of a Sufi path. The Dala'il was conceived for an individual use. It was only later with Abd al-Aziz al-Tabba, who died 1508, who belongs to the second subsequent generation of Jazuli's disciples, that collective recitation was instigated in Marrakesh and then in Fez. So I will now attempt to answer the question of the spread of the Dala'il by examining the political, economic, and institutional conditions of its circulation from the west to the east of the Muslim world. There is a gap of 2 centuries between its composition and its appearance in the heart of the Ottoman lands that still needs to be investigated. Based on Vincent Cornell's study on the Jazuliyya, we know that the prayer book quickly circulated in Jazulite circles, first in rural areas, then in cities, with the foundation by Tabba in 1475 of the first urban Jazulite Zawiya in Marrakesh, where the Dala'il was recited. Then towards the end of the 15th century, Tabba organized the first collective recitations of the Dala'il in Fez in the Madrasat al-Attari. A recent article published 2023 by the Tunisian historian Nelly Amri shows that the Dala'il spread rapidly across Ifriqiya. Barakat al-Arusi al-Qusantini, who died 1492, knew and quoted from the Dala'il when he composed his own collection of prayers, Wasilat al-Mutawassilin bifadl al-Salat ala Sayyid al-Mursalin, the support for those who seek intercession by the merit of prayer in favor of the Master of Messengers. In Sha'ban, 877, January 1473, 20 years only after the date suggested by Vincent Cornell for the completion of the Dala'il. The first mention of the Dala'il in the east of the Muslim world is to be found in an autographed copy of Khatib Chelebi, Haji Khalifa, Khatib Chelebi, who died 1657. In his bibliographic encyclopedia of books, Kesh Zunun, but it is a very brief mention. In his article on a famous commentary of the Dala'il by Muhammad al-Mahdi al-Fassi, Guy Burak has drawn attention to a note dating from the first half of the 18th century, written in the margins of the short section dedicated to Jazuli in a copy of Kashf Zunun by an anonymous bibliographer who decided to expand the very brief entry by Khatib Chelebi. And this note, which is a long note, but I'm going to just took the two most important sentences in this note that bear witness to this, and I quote, assiduously recited in the East as in the West, especially in Anatolia, Bilad al-Rum. The Dala'il al-Khayrat is a sign among the signs of God, ayah min ayat Allah. So the hypothesis of the rapid spread to the east of the Muslim world between the mid-17th century and the mid-18th century is supported by an information that I found in an important source for the history of Sufi orders dating from the 19th century, Sanusi Salsabil al-Ma'in fi al-Tariq al-Arba'in, the heavenly springs that flows over the 40 paths, which is almost entirely copied from a 17th century source, Hassan al-Ujaymi's al-Khabaya al-Zawaya. Here Sanusi notes the chain of transmission from which he received the Dala'il. It goes back to the Moroccan scholar and Shazili Sufi, Abu Salim al-Ayashi, who died 1679, who transmitted it to Hassan al-Ujaymi, and al-Ayashi himself received it from his master, Abd al-Qadir al-Fassi, who died 1680, the grandson of Abu al-Mahasin Yusuf al-Fassi, who died 1604, founder of the first Zawiya Fassiya in Fez, where he instigated the recitation of the Dala'il. Al-Ayashi and al-Ujaymi were both members of a cosmopolitan and influential group of Sufi scholars in 17th century Medina. So the spread of the Dala'il to the east of the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century was linked to internal factors in Morocco, namely the rise of the Zawiya as centers of Islamic scholarship and the expansion of the Shaziliya, and external factors, namely the renewal of the movement of Maghrebis towards the east. This renewed Maghrebi presence in the Near East was first observed by historians of economic life, notably the pioneer André Raymond. During the 17th century, the revival of the economy and of international trade in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire brought with it urban development and the renewal of mobilities in the big Arab cities. These were intellectual as much as commercial crossroads. Men traveled, as did their writings. Al-Ayashi was a Shazili affiliated to the Nasiriyya of the Sufi master from Tamgrut. Muhammad ibn Nasir, who died 1674. The Tamgrut Zawiya in the Dra Valley on the edge of the Sahara depended economically on trans-Saharan trade. It was at the heart of a book culture that was directly linked to the great centers of religious learning in the Ottoman Empire. Ibn Nasir and his son and successor, Ahmed ibn Nasir, who died 1717, founded an important library estimated to have contained over 50,000 manuscripts at the time of his death. This wealth signifies that the Zawiya had put in place an active policy of purchasing and exchanging books across its vast network of disciples. It is from Tamgrut that Al-Ayashi set out on his pilgrimage to the Hijaz. He made 3 pilgrimages in 1649, 1653, and 1661, which seems quite astonishing for the time, but confirms the wealth of Tamgrut, the relative security of the pilgrimage routes provided by the Ottomans,
and the intensity of mobilities of men and goods. Later, Ahmed ibn Nasir, the son of Muhammad ibn Nasir, would accomplish no fewer than 4 pilgrimages, and like his father, Ahmed ibn Nasir, amassed an important collection of manuscripts. On arrival in Medina, al-Ayashi became part of the city's scholarly circles. As servants of the holy places, the Ottoman sultans had continued to pursue Mamluk policies on the organization of the Hajj caravan, the restoration and embellishment of the holy places, and financial support for the numerous institutions for the transmission of knowledge that made Medina a genuine rival of Mecca in this domain. Zawiyas and ribats, libraries and schools allowed ulama and students to settle there for years or even permanently. Registers of Ottoman court records from 1790 to 1830 show 82 ribats, mostly in the center of Medina. As late as the beginning of the 20th century, before Wahhabism, the Egyptian traveler Ebatanuni marvels at the wealth of holdings in Medina's libraries by comparison with those in Mecca. These institutions, sponsored by the Ottoman elites, enabled the formation of scholarly communities within which knowledge about the Prophet, in which the Dala'il was integrated, was produced. Medina's role as a spiritual and intellectual crossroads, along with Mecca and other great Arab cities, allowed this knowledge to be disseminated along the pilgrimage route throughout the Muslim world. So I now move to my third and last section of the Dala'il's influence in religious rituals in Ottoman Egypt. So by the 18th century, the popularity of the Dala'il in Egypt was massive. The copying and the public recitation of the Dala'il was made possible thanks to the benevolence of wealthy and pious patrons. The Dala'il was recited daily in so many places in the city of Cairo, as well as in the provinces, and on so many religious occasions that the reciters were formed into brotherhoods, mashyakhat. According to Ali Pasha Mubarak, the sheikh of the brotherhood was responsible for coordinating and supervising their sessions. The Dala'il was recited at the mausoleums of the Ahl al-Bayt, of the great Egyptian saints Ahmed al-Badawi and Ibrahim al-Dessouki, the mausoleum of the Sufis buried in the Qarafa, Ibn Farid, or the Wafa'iyya. There were 2 other brotherhoods of this type: the brotherhood of the reciters of the Burda, Mashayikh Khayrat al-Burda, and the brotherhood of the reciters of the Hizb al-Bar, the litany of al-Jazuli, Mashayikh Khayrat al-Hizb. The members of these brotherhoods were called Ashab al-Dalil, Ashab al-Burda, and Ashab al-Hizb. The existence of these brotherhoods suggests a virtual canonization of these 3 devotional texts to the Prophet, which were often printed together in the 19th century. Ali Pasha Mubarak describes rituals that go back to the Ottoman era, the procession in which the new kiswa, the cloth that covers the Kaaba in Mecca, was paraded through Cairo at night in conjunction with Quran recitation and the reading of al-Jazuli's Dala'il al-Khayrat and al-Jazuli's Hizb al-Bar in the Diwan al-Muhafaza. Under the Ottomans, Sheikh al-Bakri, head of the Ashraf family of the Bakriya, was in charge of the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, during which the Dala'il al-Khayrat was recited along the Mawlid al-Barzanji, Qasidat al-Burda, and the Hizb al-Bakri. Recent works by historians of art and religious materiality have provided crucial information on the prayer book as an object of devotion. Codicological studies by Hiba Abid on Maghribi manuscripts of the Dala'il reveal a great variety of models, from the most luxurious and richly illuminated copy to the cheapest, and many different formats, from imposing volumes intended to remain in one place in a mosque to pocket volumes that were carried on the person for individual reading or as a talisman. Thus, the prayer book affected all levels of society. In the Maghreb, it was the only religious book, apart from the Quran, to have illustrations, images of the mosque of Mecca and Medina, and of the Prophet's tomb in Medina, Rawda Sharifa, the noble garden, with its pupilled minbar as a figurative representation of the hadith: whoever stands between my grave and my pupil, it is as if he's standing in paradise. The success of the Dala'il in Ottoman Turkish societies is part of a much larger production and consumption of devotional objects and other forms of religious materiality associated with the Prophet Muhammad in the Ottoman lands. The same virtues of protection and benediction were attributed to the famous hilye, literally ornament, which combines a visual form of Ottoman art to the Shama'il of the Prophet, a short description of his inner and outer beauty. The channels and timing of the introduction of the Dala'il into Egypt remains to be investigated. But the Egyptian scholarly and cultural environment laid the ground for its reception. In the 15th century, during the time of al-Jazuli, major works, some of them monumental, whose authors are jurists of immense prestige and eminent experts on the science of hadith, give more space to the Prophet's unique qualities and miracles and to the veneration due to him. Asqalani, 1449, died 1449. Fath al-Bari, Victory of the Creator, fi Sharh Sahih al-Bukhari. Suyuti died 1505. Al-Khasais al-Kubra, the special attributes of the Prophet Muhammad. Al-Qastalani died 1517. Al-Mawahib al-Laduniya, fi al-Minah al-Muhammadiyya, the divine gifts contained in the Muhammadan graces. These Egyptian scholars enjoyed an international reputation, and some of their works circulated outside Egypt during their lifetime or shortly after they died. They also wrote treatises on the practice of praying for the Prophet, following the Quranic injunction, God and his angels bless the Prophet, or you who believe invoke divine blessings on him and greet him. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. Quran 33:56. Drawing on the writings of his predecessors, the Egyptian As-Sakhawi, who died 1497, composed the largest synthesis to date about the prayer on the Prophet, called Al-Qawl al-Badi' fi Salat al-Habib al-Shafi', the radiant discourse concerning the evocation of blessings on the beloved intercessor. The first sheikh of the Jazuliyah, Abdullah al-Ghazwani, who died in 1528, claims that Jazuli spent a number of years, sometimes between 1446 and 1453, according to Cornell, studying at Al-Azhar with the Qadiri Sheikh Abdul Aziz al-Ajami, who was the real influence for the composition of the Dala'il, still according to Cornell. To support this contention, Vincent Cornell noticed that the version of al-Jilani's minor prayer reproduced by Jazuli in the Dala'il is identical to the version reproduced by Sakhawi. Cornell suggests that Jazuli first composed the Dala'il upon his return to Morocco from Egypt during the years in which he organized the Jazuliyah Sufi order. During this period, the end of the Mamluk and the beginning of the Ottomans, Sufi scholarly milieu of Cairo around Jalaluddin al-Suyuti and his follower Abdul Wahab al-Sha'rani, who died 15 65, probably the two most prominent Sufi scholars of pre-modern Egypt, elaborated a doctrine of sainthood based on attaining a waking vision of the Prophet through assiduous practice of the Tasliyah and being guided and inspired directly by him in the same way a disciple is guided by his master. This is clearly described by Sha'rani in his textbook on Sufi ethics, Lawaqih al-Anwar al-Qudsiyya, and I quote him, "Our path consists of the assiduous recitation of the Tasliyah until the Prophet is by our side, even when we are awake, and we become companions just like the companions, and we are able to ask him about religious questions." Sha'rani informs us that in 1491, his master, Nuruddin al-Shuni, who died 1537, instituted the Majlis Salat al-Nabi at Al-Azhar, an entire night of collective prayers devoted to the Prophet, a practice that was attacked by certain jurists. These assemblies for prayer on the Prophet quickly spread onto other Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire, such as Damascus, where, according to the historian Muhibbi, who died in 1699, it was introduced into the Umayyad mosque in 1563 by a disciple of al-Shuni. These majalis were attested by Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, who died in 1566 in Mecca during the first half of the 16th century. For the production in Arabic of collections of prayers for the Prophet, we have some estimates based on research in library catalogs and bibliographical dictionaries by the Islamologist Amin Hamidun in his unpublished thesis, A Textual Examination of the Practice of Praying for the Prophet. He observes that the spread of the Dala'il led to the production of other collections from the end of the 15th century and throughout the 16th century, with a revival of this production in the second half of the 18th century and in the 19th century, with the Maghreb and Egypt as the two major production centers. Some of these collections make reference to the Dala'il without necessarily adopting the same form. This renewal of production corresponds to a new expansion of Sufi brotherhoods in the 18th century onwards, such as the Khalwatiyya in Egypt, and the founding of new orders such as the Tijaniyya and those like the Sanusiyya that sprang from the teachings of the Moroccan Sufi Ahmed ibn Idris, who died 1837 in North Africa. These orders emerged in a historical context marked by the decline of Muslim empires, the expansion of European imperialism, followed by the direct colonization of large parts of the Muslim world, starting in the 19th century onwards. The founders of these new or renewed Sufi orders presented themselves as mujaddid of the Sunnah of the Prophet, renovator of the Sunnah of the Prophet, and put the prayer for the Prophet at the heart of their initiatic teachings. They composed their own prayers of all collections of prayers that became the identity marker of their path. Tijani's prayer of the opener, Salat al-Fatih, and the jewel of perfection, Jawharat al-Kamal, Ahmed ibn Idris, Salat al-Azimiyya. In Egypt, the renewed production of collection of prayers for the Prophet is linked to the emergence of the Khalwatiyya in the first half of the 18th century. This great Turco-Ottoman brotherhood was brought from Syria to Egypt by the Syrian Mustafa al-Bakri, who died 1749. It expanded rapidly, and this also affected the Maghreb, because the two great Maghrebi Sufi brotherhoods of the 18th century, of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Tijaniyya and the Rahmaniyya, sprang from the Egyptian Khalwatiyya. Mustafa al-Bakri was a Syrian scholar, a disciple of another great scholar from Damascus, Nabulsi. But unlike Nabulsi, he was also the founder of a Sufi path, which probably explains why this fine scholar, well-versed in the works of Ibn Arabi in the domain of Sufism, wrote almost nothing but Sufi handbooks and prayers and litanies for the disciples' daily wird, brought together in the pocket collection Majmu' Awrat Sayyidi Mustafa al-Bakri. He composed no fewer than 6 collections of prayers for the Prophet, which makes him the 18th century's most prolific author in this domain. But the collection that would be in use in the rituals of the Khalwatiyya, Egyptian Khalwatiyya, is from the 3rd paramount master of the order, the Egyptian Ahmed al-Dardir, who died in 1786 as Salawat al-Dardiriyya. So I am now reached to my conclusion. In the history of Sufism, the Dala'il appeared at a time of change in the long-standing but dynamic relationship of the Sufis to the Prophet. The first prayers appeared in the 12th, 13th century during a time of decline of the Abbasid Caliphate. Its fall in 1258 reinforced the authority of the Sufis, as indicated by the increase in the number of hagiographies describing a word order in which the true masters are the saints, who form an invisible government with its own council, diwan, and hierarchy, above which is the pole, the qutb, the supreme recourse, and universal succor, the archetype of which is the Prophet Muhammad. Sufi became promoters of the veneration of the Prophet at exactly the period during which the first great mystical paths were founded by Sufi masters considered to be descendants of the Prophet and earthly heirs of his spiritual authority. The renewal of the genre in Morocco and Egypt from the 15th century onwards corresponds to a new expansion of Sufism and its institutions in unprecedented ways, which brought them new social and political weight and access to the realms of power. The fact that Sufis assigned themselves such an elevated status as direct heirs of the Prophet through spiritual intimacy with him and renovator, mujaddid of his sunnah, reveals how their authority in society and the material wealth of their institutions was probably, as I said, unprecedented in the pre-modern era. In the history of Sufi order, Vincent Corner pointed out that the Dala'il may have marked the evolution of a certain exclusiveness that would typify modern Sufi path. I quote him, "The Jazuliyya practice an exclusivist type of Sufism in which personal salvation depended on membership in the order." He quotes this statement of al-Jazuli from his hagiographer Muhammad al-Mahdi al-Fassi, "O assembly of seekers, regard your master, Prophet Muhammad, for he is with me. I have no spiritual insight except through him. O assembly of Muslims, do you know that the chosen one, may God bless him and preserve him, is near to me, and that his authority, hukmuhu, is in my hands." So the authors of Tasliya that appeared in the 18th century received their inspiration directly from God's messenger, who instructed them to form new paths in which these prayers would be recited exclusively by their disciples and become the identity marker of a new foundation. The saint who had perfected the Muhammadan model also inherited his attributes of guidance, intercession in this world, and salvation in the hereafter. At the end of the 19th century, the Syrian Yusuf al-Nabhani, who died in 1932, compiled the prayers handed down from the 12th century to his own time, along with their commentaries in 2 encyclopedic works of Abdallah Salawat ala Sayyid al-Sadat and Sa'adat al-Darain fi Salat ala Sayyid al-Qawnayn. He collected, preserved, and fixed in print for the first time a centuries-long literary tradition which he probably felt was threatened by the rise of Islamic reformism. Meanwhile, Nabhani's contemporary, the Egyptian Muhammad al-Shukairi, composed a treatise with the evocative title As-Sunan wal-Mubtada'at al-Muta'alika bil-Ad'iyya wal-Salawat. Al-Shukairi doesn't take issue with the fact of praying for the Prophet, which is a Quranic injunction, but he criticizes the prayers composed by Sufis, which he considers exaggerated. He specifically condemns Jazuli's Dala'il al-Khayrat and Nabhani's Afdal al-Salawat and describes the prayers of the Khalwatiyya masters al-Bakri and al-Bardir as bid'ah, along with Tijani's Salat al-Fatih and the Mashishiyya. Al-Shukairi and other reformists believed that the Prophet is definitely dead and thus incapable of offering aid or even intercession at any point during the interlude preceding the end of the world. Such critiques were not new. Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 1328, had already expressed similar ideas in his numerous fatwa. Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas will be diffused by Wahhabism. At the root of this condemnation is also the old rejection of a scholarly religious elite of popular piety, the piety of the common people, the Amma, and its manifestation, which are considered too exuberant, too ostentatious, and under the influence of a certain Orientalism, even folkloric. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That's quite thought-provoking, I'm sure. We can take some questions, I think, from the audience. I'm sure there are quite a few questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for this delightful presentation. This was new to me, Abdul Aziz Dabbagh, his role in the spread of, you're saying these are public sessions that he, in his Zawiya and among his disciples, is instituting?
Yeah, so according, I mean, as you know, you know very well that the specialist of the Jazuliyya is, of course, Vincent Cornell, and in his book, The Realm of the Saint, he mentions that the teachings of Jazuli first spread mainly in rural areas, and the first urban Jazuli Zawiya is in Marrakesh. Yeah, I thought it was in Fez, Madrasat al-Atarin, but reading again through Cornell, I found out that the first urban Zawiya was in Marrakesh, where the recitation of the Dala'il was instigated, and then he built a second Zawiya. He moved to Fez, and he didn't build a second Zawiya. He moved into the Madrasat al-Atarin, and that was in Fez that the collective recitations were instigated. So yeah, I myself, I didn't know about this one in Marrakesh, but yes, if you look into...
The other question I had was about, we know that Jazuli writes these two treatises other than he has a Risala fil Mahabba, and I think he has a Risala fil Tawheed as well. But these clearly don't seem to, I mean, I've only seen one manuscript of each text. And so I guess my question is, you know, how significant was Jazuli the person over Jazuli, the author of the Dala'il al-Khayrat? Because these other two texts, we don't seem to have manuscripts circulating. Again, they're also very short treatises. I think, you know, we're looking at about 12 folios, something like this. So,
it's a very interesting question. I believe that if we focus on text themselves, they don't tell us that much, as you just said. So we have to understand the whole context and the relationship of the Jazuli circle. I'm not a specialist of the Jazuliya. I'm a specialist of the Khalwatiyya in Egypt. But I had to look into, I looked into secondary sources to get information about the whole context. But it's a very interesting question because you mentioned these two, but how could we judge the influence of Jazuli outside his writings? That's what I try to do with the Dala'il, trying to put it into a broader context. Because the Dala'il on its own, okay, but if you don't understand the whole building up of this prophetology, the whole building up of this economy of piety that is part of, you don't understand the importance, the significance of this, and I know, I mean, I read something about of this research al-Mahabba. I think Cornell has done some work on it, but, and he insists about this idea that what is important above all is the relationship you establish to the prophet. It's more about experiencing, you know, the love of the prophet than, and through, I think it's linked with the Dala'il. They must be linked with each other. The composition of the Dala'il, Risalat al-Mahabba, and what I know is that he was a very, he seems that he built his personality because you have to understand I'm not a specialist of Morocco, the spirit, but there are some kind of messianic, there's some kind of ideology running through Morocco after the Almoravid and Almohad, and I think he's a produce of this ideology. I believe that when we want to study religious history, we really have to go on to the long duration, what Brodel has coined the longue durée, but I think it's very important because it's not so much about the ideas. The ideas are really the same, but it's how they are appropriated and into the specific context. Because when you're a religious author, you don't want to bring, you want to be part of the tradition. You know, you want to be faithful to the tradition, and but at the same time, a religious author was to assess his own personality, you know, and wants to stand out. So how do we understand, you know, the tradition and how each author is reappropriating it in his context? So that's, so I think that Risalat al-Mahabba must be put into relationship with the Dala'il and with the whole context of, because there is a lot of, the Dala'il is really about the love of a prophet. It's really, so you have to link it to his other works.
Yeah, I would like to go back to the question of the circulation and the long success of this little prayer book. Do you have any information about translation of the Dala'il al-Khayrat?
So there are many translations because the Dala'il was really considered like, the Jazuli claimed that he received it directly from the Prophet. So it's a bit like the Quran, it was so sacred, but there are lots of commentaries. And I found the Guy Burak's article on the commentary, the famous commentary, because the Dala'il was diffused to the east, but at the same time with its commentary by Muhammad al-Mahdi al-Fasi, who died in the second half of the 17th century. And the Guy Burak really pointed out the role played by the commentary in the diffusion of the Dala'il. So we, working on, the commentaries were really part of this production and of symbolic goods. We tend to work on text, but commentaries are very, very important because they help to diffuse, and so the commentaries of al-Mahdi al-Fasi was translated in Ottoman very, very quickly. But the Dala'il were never translated because it is considered like the coming directly from the Prophet. So it's a bit like the Quran, you can't translate it. But there were lots of commentaries of the Quran. I don't know about any translation of the Dala'il.
Well, I asked this question because some 40 years ago, or more than 40 years ago, I bought here in Cairo a copy of the Dala'il al-Khayrat in Turkish. It was...
or maybe something very recent, but
So,
are you sure it was a copy of the Dala'il?
Well, at the time I did not know really Turkish, so I could not be sure if it's a translation or a commentary, but it was exactly the same book as the one you show, with the same format, the same framing of the pages at the beginning of the Hizb, for example, and so on.
Yeah.
And I showed it to the late Gilbert Delanoux, and he told me it's un petit livre de prière.
Yeah.
And the Turks also could have it. That's it. He did not know Turkish, so
Yeah.
I don't know exactly.
So what you see a lot is the Dala'il, and in between lines,
Yeah.
commentaries in Turkish or Persian.
Yeah.
Persian. You see a lot of these.
It's commentary or translation? Commentary, always.
I beg your pardon?
The interline text
Yes.
is always commentary, neither translation.
It's the between the lines of the Dala'il, you have the commentaries in different languages. Yeah.
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 Okay.
And also after and there are lots of other collections of prayers that circulated in the Ottoman Empire. In Am al-Sharif, for example, was one of them, was very, very popular among, so there were other collections of prayers. I mean, the Dala'il is the tip of the iceberg because it's the devotional literature to the Prophet is immense. But it's long been neglected because I mean all these texts are in library catalogs. They are located under the title devotional literature. So but this word devotional literature translates only their function, but they are actually very rich in terms of theological, in terms of theology, prophetology, mysticism, and they are very, they diffuse actually, and that's why I found it so interesting, because we study religious texts, but then most of these texts were not accessible to the Amma. So which kind of Islam did they practice?
Yeah.
But devotional literature informs us how ideas that they were formulated by scholars were diffused to a society where oral culture was predominant, and how a very sophisticated culture was accessible to a popular audience through oral culture. That's how ideas were diffused to Muslims in pre-modern societies, through oral culture. Nobody were reading books from jurists or complicated books on fiqh or kalam, and which kind of Islam was practiced. Yeah. And that's why devotional literature is very interesting in that sense, that it's full of very, very profound thinking, but accessible to a popular audience. And the reason why Sufis promoted this literature is that they consider themselves as the true heirs of the Prophet and the true heirs of his authority, al-Wirasa. And this was very debated among scholars who were in competition between each other, who was representing the authority of the Prophet. So this devotional literature has consequences in our understanding of politics and social integration of Sufism and
was the one who started Majlis al-Salah ala Rasul in al-Azhar al-Sharif. I'm just curious to know if he has used the Jazuli book during the sessions in al-Azhar al-Sharif, and if this was the starting point of the spread of the Jazuli book of Salah wa Salam ala Rasul in Egypt.
No. Okay. So Shuni Sharani tells us that actually he started organizing these Majlis Salawat ala Nabi in Tanta when he was when he was still a young man. He started organizing this Majlis in Tanta, then he moved to Cairo and he organized them at Al-Azhar Mosque. Shuni was the author of 2 collections of prayers for the Prophet. We have, I can give you the references, and we don't know which kind of, but there were collections of prayers, but it wasn't like a zikr form, you know. They were reciting prayers. I can give you the titles of the 2 collections. He wrote 2 collections of prayers, but it was all night spent reciting praise for the Prophet, and this practice moved to Damascus, and it was called al-Mahya al-Sharifa, you know, and it's still in Damascus. There's still Mahya Sharifa, but it was just spending all night reciting praise for the Prophet until, you know, you become an intimate. But it wasn't like a Jazulis who was really like a zikr form. No, Jazulis again, probably Jazuli Dala'il probably arrived with the renewal of pilgrimages, rahalat, of Maghribi renewal rahalat in the 17th century, as I mentioned during my presentation. Yeah. Mohammed al-Bakri, who's Adam Sabra has written a lot about, has written a lot of 2 or 3 collections of prayers for the Prophet at the same time.
Yes, I just want to mention that there is a very good website called Dala'il al-Khayrat.com, and there is some very interesting material as well.
Yeah, there is a whole website. Yeah. And I went to Al-Azhar, behind Al-Azhar to the bookshops on Friday, and you find the Dala'il next to the Quran in all the bookshops.
So if no one else has a question, I'll ask a question. Thank you very much. It was super informative, and it's really very interesting to see how you've used Dala'il, al-Khayrat to connect these kind of larger trends. I was particularly interested in the case of the scholars in Medina and their kind of riwayah of Dala'il al-Khayrat having a location. One of the first places I would expect the text to have gone was Medina, right? I mean, I would have expected the text to go there kind of first or you know, soon after being written. That tends to be the case with, you know, anything in praise of the Prophet. There's a kind of performance or whatever. So there's presumably a couple of centuries of the Dala'il being present in Medina orally before we have, before it enters a scholarly record, right? And the scholarly record is, you know, consists of biographical dictionaries, commentaries. That's what I'm calling the scholarly record. But of course, the text like al-Dala'il or al-Burda has this kind of vernacular life. So it's really a big problem for us, right? Because, you know, we want to talk about things like the ritual use of these texts. We want to talk about things like religious materiality. We also want to think about things like belief in ritual. But we don't have a textual record for much of it. And popular religion, where it is accessible to us, is in texts like this, right? It's only through particular texts like this. You know, I don't necessarily know what to think about it. I mean, this is a famously simple text in terms of being able to read it, right? Which is quite interesting because it's connected to other texts which are much more challenging linguistically and also kind of metaphorically, right? So texts like, you know, Burda or what I want to ask about is this whole tradition we have preserved and lost of Madh Rasul, right? I mean, the big picture overall, beyond, even larger than Sufi orders, if there can be something larger than Sufi orders, is this idea of Madh Rasul, this huge library of material, right? Not every text for Madh Rasul is devotional or ritualistic, right? I mean, it can't be. So how are we going to identify what texts really sort of matter in historical terms? I mean, like you have a text like this where we can read into it a lot of theological and prophetological history, but then we have this huge body of other texts, which are, I would call them sort of literary texts for Madh Rasul, which are not really read in this way. And I don't quite understand, like, methodologically how we're going to approach this problem.
I'm not sure I understand exactly your question, because if it's Madh al-Nabi, it has to be devotional literature. You mean that they were not necessarily intended to a wider audience? Or, I mean, I mean, as I say, devotional literature is an enormous corpus, and because, of course, we know about the Dala'il because it was really, but there were other collections that were in circulation and in sub-Saharan Africa, and other colleagues have done work on other collections of prayer that were recited, and they spread outside Sufi circles to reach, I mean, a popular audience. But your question is that what to do with all this literature, and I'm not sure I understand your. Could you express it in the?
Yes, I'll try and say it again. Okay, so in the body of literature that is in praise of the Prophet,
yes,
there's a range of texts, some highly complex, some less complex.
Yeah, okay, I understand. So it's a bit what I explained, is that some highly complex probably were not intended to a popular audience. But the reason why the Dala'il was so widespread was because it was graspable. The prayers were not that allusive, were not that full of elliptic, but nevertheless,
the idea is that about the metaphysical eternal presence of the Prophet and about the possibility of invoking blessing about the Prophet, the idea that the Prophet understand the prayers of the believer and respond to them. It spread the idea that for the Sufi who recite the prayer, he can become himself an incarnation of the model and be in the presence. It does. Some of this collection contains all the main doctrinal ideas of the Sufi that spread, as I said, with the Tustari wal Halaj, but were diffused in this devotional literature. But the most complex ideas obviously were definitely not accessible to, but in that case, this complex idea will not be composed in a kind of Madh Nabawi. That's why I don't understand. Madh Nabawi is a genre of praising the Prophet intended, to be recited orally, loudly, by specialists, maddah, munshidin. As soon as you say Madh Nabawi, is an oral culture. So there is a Madh Nabawi which is not intended to popular audience. Otherwise, it's a different type of content. Do you know what I try to? Madh Nabawi is really intended to be recited in public and to be heard, basically to be heard. The other thing is that we focus on the textual content, but for most Muslims, just listening to it is barakah. It's just listening to the Quran. It's the fact well, I'm not working on this type of, but the listening of the Madh Nabawi is just already being with the Prophet. It doesn't matter that much about this. It's really the idea of, it's like being present. It's like we mentioning it's just putting yourself in the state of experiencing the presence of the Prophet. And that's why the reason why the Dala'il was so popular is that it contains these pictures of the holy places and the resting place of the Prophet. And during the Ottoman period, some Dala'il copies contain images of the relics of the Prophet, his mantle, his sandals, and historian of art. You invited Christiane Gruber. She must have mentioned this, how these images were touched because of the barakah that those relics and those salawat contain. So we have also to. Yesterday, when I went behind Al-Azhar, I went to a bookseller that I know, who is a Tijani, and I mentioned the Dala'il. And for him, he mentioned the Dala'il as really the barakah that the Dala'il brings to people. He told me, فيها الدنيا والآخرة. So he said everything, فيها الدنيا والآخرة. So there is barakah for this word and salvation of the hereafter. So for most people, listening to the Dala'il is like listening to the Quran. So for me, what was interesting is that really it is a sign of the sacralization of the Prophet and against a sacralization against which the Wahhabi will find their own identities, is fighting the Sufis and the way they sacralize the Prophet. All the Wahhabi doctrine on the Tawheed is against the Islam of its time, the Islam promoted by the Ottomans, and the sacralization of the Prophet. So the whole Wahhabi doctrine is built against the sacralization of the Prophet, against the metaphysic reality of the Prophet, against the ontological primacy of the Prophet, against the Nur Muhammadi, against all these things, and against Alam al-Ghayb, the idea that there is a kind of barzakh, and that from the barzakh the Prophet continues to spread his rahmah, mercy onto the believers until he will interfere for all humanity at the Last Judgment. It's against all these ideas that the Wahhabism was built.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I wanted to ask about how, when you speak about the Dala'il as considered to be as sacred as the Quran, because Jazuli claimed he received it directly from the Prophet, was it considered to be the word of the Prophet rather than the authorship of Jazuli, same as the Quran being considered the word of God and not the authorship of the Prophet?
Exactly. Jazuli claimed that the Salawat were inspired to him by the Prophet. That's why it made this. And for the people who listen to the Salawat, they think it's so perfect, it's so beautiful. It's actually a very beautiful collection of prayers, to be honest, that they think that it had to be inspired to Jazuli by the Prophet. And after that, I mean, but of course, it gave Jazuli a kind of authority, claiming this inheritance from the Prophet gave him a lot of authority among his disciples and his community. And after Jazuli, that's what I focus on on my article in Ijmas, is that other Sufis will claim that they had vision, waking vision of the Prophet, and that the Prophet inspired their own collections of prayers, and it gives them, of course, the authority of the Prophet. And so we had walaya, which is divine friendship, divine intimacy. Walaya is proximity to God, but with time, with the sacralization of the Prophet, Sufis were seeking, intimacy with the Prophet as a way to intimacy with God. So that's how the whole collection starting developed, how to reach intimacy with the Prophet, and the collection, the recitation of these prayers was a mean to intimacy to the Prophet. And then, as you could see in the Mashishiyya, is your veil towards your presence. So you have to. So the idea is that I really wanted to understand how did the Sufism became integrated into society and reach so much power in pre-modern society. So it was built on this kind of ideological background that they are the true heirs of the Prophet, and they developed this idea through this writing on the Prophet. And from the 9th century, they were in competition with the ulama on who are the true heirs of the Prophet. And Wahhabism is exactly the same idea. Who are the true heirs of the Prophet? Wahhabi claim being the true heirs of the Prophet, and that the Sufis were just not holding his sunnah properly.
I think we need to thank you again for this wonderful evening. We have a small reception outside, so maybe some people would like to chat a bit more with Professor Chih. And again, I remind you of our second lecture next Saturday, also here at Oriental Hall at 6 p.m. Thank you again very much.